I didn't raise my voice when the HOA board announced they were foreclosing on my house over an 8-by-10 garden shed. I just opened my folder and pulled out the original 1923 Resort Development Master Deed, sliding it across the table to their attorney. The room went dead quiet. Their lawyer picked up the document with the kind of careful reverence you'd use handling a loaded gun. And I watched his face change as he read the property description. 27 pages of legal text that proved I didn't just own the lot. They were trying to suss I owned the entire 340-acre tract they're precious. Lakeside Meadows development was built on. Then I leaned forward and delivered the line I'd been practicing for 8 months. Before you foreclose on my property, you might want to explain to your residents why they've been paying you dues to live on land I never sold. The whole nightmare began 2 years ago when my wife Sarah and I bought what we thought was our forever home in Lakeside Meadows. It was a modest ranch house on half an acre, backing up to the community lake. Nothing fancy but perfect for what we needed. Sarah was recovering from her second round of chemotherapy, and we'd both decided that life was too short to spend it commuting to jobs we didn't love in a city that exhausted us. The house came with mature oak trees, a small vegetable garden that the previous owner had started, and a view of the lake that made Sarah cry the first time she saw it. She'd always wanted to live somewhere she could watch sunrise over water, and this place delivered that every single morning. We weren't looking to make waves or change anything. We just wanted to tend our garden, maybe get a dog, and let Sarah heal in peace while I worked remotely and pretended to understand the finer points of tomato cultivation. The neighborhood itself was pleasant enough, developed around a natural lake with winding streets that followed the shoreline and preserved most of the mature trees. The houses were built in the early 2000s, ranging from modest starter homes like ours to sprawling lakefront estates that probably cost more than I'd make in a decade. Most of our neighbors were quiet families or empty nesters who kept to themselves. The kind of people who waved from their driveways and minded their own business. The Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association managed the common areas, maintained the lake access points, and enforced basic covenants about fence heights and exterior colors. At least that's what their welcome packet claimed. The reality was considerably more intrusive. It had rules about everything from the specific shade of brown your mulch could be to the exact height grass was allowed to grow before triggering a violation notice. But we figured we could live with reasonable restrictions in exchange for well-maintained common areas and property value protection. The trouble started 6 months after we moved in. On a Saturday morning in June, when I was building a simple storage shed in our backyard, it was nothing elaborate, just a basic 8-by-10 structure where Sarah could store her gardening tools and I could keep my workshop equipment organized. I'd pulled the proper building permits from the county, followed all the setback requirements, and even chose materials that matched our house's exterior. I was measuring lumber when a woman in her 60s marched into my backyard without invitation and informed me that I was in violation of HOA covenants for unpermitted accessory structures. She introduced herself as Margaret Kellerman, the HOA Architectural Review Committee chairwoman, and explained that all construction required pre-approval regardless of county permits. When I pointed out that I'd already received county approval and was following all local building codes, she became condescending and handed me a thick packet of forms to complete. The application process required detailed architectural drawings, material samples, and a $150 review fee, with no guarantee of approval for a garden shed that I was building on my own property. With proper permits, I spent the next 3 weeks jumping through their bureaucratic hoops, submitting drawings and material samples and paying fees for what should have been a simple weekend project. The Architectural Review Committee met monthly, so I had to wait until July to present my application. The meeting was held in Margaret's living room, attended by 5 neighbors who apparently had nothing better to do than judge other people's building projects. They spent 45 minutes debating whether my shed's roof pitch was harmonious with the neighborhood aesthetic and whether the window placement created visual continuity with existing structures. In the end, they denied my application. Because the shed was too utilitarian, didn't include architectural interest elements like decorative shutters or flower boxes, they suggested I redesign it to look more like a miniature house and reapply next month. I went home and told Sarah we were dealing with people who had too much time and too little sense. but I figured I'd humor them and add some cosmetic details. To get approval, the second application was denied for different reasons. The decorative elements I'd added were now excessive ornamentation that created visual discord with our house's clean lines. Margaret suggested I hire a professional architect to create a design that would integrate seamlessly with the community's design philosophy. When I explained that I wasn't going to pay an architect hundreds of dollars to design a garden shed, she reminded me that I'd already violated the covenants by beginning construction without approval and was subject to daily fines until the violation was resolved. The fine started at $50 per day and would continue until I either completed an approved structure or removed what they called my illegal construction. I'd been living in Lakeside Meadows for 8 months, and these people were trying to charge me $1,500 a month for the privilege of storing Sarah's garden tools in my own backyard. That's when I stopped trying to appease them and started treating this like the legal battle it had become. I researched HOA law in our state and discovered that architectural review committees had to follow their own written procedures and couldn't create arbitrary standards that weren't specified in the covenants. I requested copies of all previous shed approvals to establish precedent, but Margaret claimed those records were confidential board business. I submitted a formal appeal, citing procedural violations and requesting a hearing with the full HOA board. They scheduled it for September. 2 months away, and informed me the daily fines would continue accumulating until then. By this point, Sarah was getting sicker from the stress than she'd been from her cancer treatments. She'd lie awake at night calculating how much money we were losing while these people played games with our lives. Our neighbor mentioned that Margaret's own daughter had built a nearly identical shed the previous year without any architectural review at all. The appeal hearing was a farce designed to waste my time and drain my resources. The 5-member board sat behind a folding table in the community center like they were judges instead of volunteers who'd been elected by 30% voter turnout. Margaret presented a slideshow about maintaining community standards, while their attorney quoted selective passages from the covenants that supposedly gave them unlimited authority over architectural decisions. When I presented evidence that they had approved similar structures without requiring architectural drawings or decorative elements, they claimed each application was evaluated individually based on site-specific factors. When I pointed out that my shed was actually higher quality than most of the approved structures, they said quality wasn't the issue. Compliance with the review process was. They upheld the denial and informed me I had 30 days to remove my illegal structure, or face foreclosure proceedings for the accumulated fines, which had now reached $4,200. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at foreclosure papers and wondering how my life had come to this. 2 years ago, Sarah and I had been successful professionals planning for retirement. Now we were facing the loss of our home because I'd built a garden shed that met every building code and safety standard, but lacked sufficient architectural interest. I felt like we'd moved into some kind of suburban prison where elected volunteers could destroy your life on a whim. But sometime around midnight, while I was reading the foreclosure documents for the 3rd time, I noticed something odd. The legal description of our property didn't match what I remembered from our purchase agreement. The foreclosure notice described our lot as Parcel 23B of Lakeside Meadows Planned Unit Development, but our original deed described it as Lot 4 of Block 7, Clearwater Resort Subdivision. I'd never heard of Clearwater Resort. I couldn't figure out why 2 legal documents would describe the same property differently. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office and requested every document related to our property. Going back to its original development, what I found buried in those dusty files changed everything I thought I knew about where we lived. Our house wasn't just part of Lakeside Meadows, it was part of something much older and much larger. The original property had been developed in 1923 as Clearwater Resort, a 340-acre recreational development that included the lake, surrounding forest, and what was then called the main lodge and guest cottage area. The resort had operated for 40 years before going bankrupt in the 1960s, but the original master deed had never been dissolved or transferred. According to the county records, the entire Clearwater Resort tract had been sold as a single unit in 1967 to something called Mountain Heritage Trust. which had subdivided and sold individual lots while retaining ownership of the underlying master deed. I spent 3 days tracing the ownership chain through various trusts and estate transfers before I found the final link that made my blood run cold and my heart race at the same time. Mountain Heritage Trust had been dissolved in 1989, and its assets had been distributed to the family of its founder, Robert Clearwater. Robert Clearwater was my wife's grandfather, the man who'd left her a small inheritance when he died in 1991. Sarah had always assumed the inheritance was just a few $1,000s that her family had used for college expenses. But the probate records told a different story. Robert Clearwater had left his granddaughter the entire Clearwater Resort master deed, including mineral rights, water rights, and something called reversionary interest in all subdivided parcels. The inheritance had been processed by a law firm that no longer existed, and somehow the deed transfer had never been properly recorded with the county. For 30 years, Sarah had unknowingly owned not just our house, but the land under every house in Lakeside Meadows. The HOA had been collecting dues and enforcing covenants on property they didn't control, property that belonged to my wife. I spent the next month working with a property attorney to verify what I'd discovered and figure out how to properly assert Sarah's ownership rights. The legal situation was complex but absolutely clear. The original Clearwater Resort master deed took precedence over any subsequent HOA covenants or development agreements. Sarah owned the underlying land, the lake, the common areas, and most importantly, the legal authority to determine how the property was used and managed. The HOA's power derived from agreements with individual lot owners. But those agreements were essentially meaningless, since the lot owners had never actually owned the land they'd thought they were buying. They'd purchased houses and development rights, but the land itself had remained with the Clearwater family through the inheritance trust. Every monthly HOA due payment, every architectural review decision, every fine and fee they'd collected for 15 years had been based on authority they didn't legally possess. The foreclosure hearing was scheduled for October 15th in the county courthouse. I arrived early and sat in the back row, watching Margaret Kellerman and the HOA attorney set up their presentation about my willful violation of community standards. They had charts showing the progression of my fines, photographs of my shed, taken from various angles, copies of all the correspondence where I'd supposedly refused to comply with reasonable architectural standards. Margaret wore a navy suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never lost an HOA dispute. Their attorney was younger, probably hired from a firm that specialized in property management law. And he kept checking his notes, like he was preparing for a routine administrative procedure. They clearly expected this to be a quick victory that would send a message to other residents about the consequences of defying the Architectural Review Committee. When my turn came to present, I walked to the front of the courtroom and placed 3 documents on the judge's bench: Sarah's inherited master deed, the county survey showing the original Clearwater Resort boundaries, and a formal notice of ownership that I'd had prepared by my attorney. I explained calmly that the foreclosure was invalid because the HOA lacked legal authority to impose fines or liens on property they didn't control. The judge examined my documents for what felt like 10 minutes, while the HOA attorney frantically whispered with Margaret. Then he asked the HOA to present evidence of their legal authority over the property in question. Their attorney stammered something about established community standards and binding covenants. But when pressed for documentation, he couldn't produce any deed or agreement that superseded Sarah's inherited ownership rights. The judge dismissed the foreclosure proceeding and ordered the HOA to remove all liens and fines from our property within 30 days. But that was just the beginning. My attorney filed a quiet title action to formally establish Sarah's ownership of the entire Clearwater Resort tract, including all the land under the Lakeside Meadows development. We sent notice to every property owner in the community explaining the situation and offering to sell them the land under their houses for fair market value. Most people were reasonable once they understood what had happened. They'd bought their homes in good faith and deserved the chance to purchase clear title to their land. But the HOA board fought the whole process. hiring expensive attorneys and filing motions claiming that Sarah's inheritance was somehow fraudulent or invalid. They spent over $80,000 in legal fees trying to prove they had authority over land they'd never owned. While their own residents grew increasingly angry about the uncertainty and potential costs, the final settlement took 6 months to negotiate. But it was worth the wait. Sarah sold clear title to the land under each house for exactly what the original developers had charged in the 1990s, adjusted for inflation. Most residents were grateful to finally own their land outright instead of just holding development. Rights subject to HOA control. The lake and common areas were transferred to a simple property owners association with minimal rules and no architectural review committee. Margaret Kellerman resigned from the board and moved to Arizona, apparently unwilling to live in a community where she couldn't control other people's building projects. The HOA's management company was terminated and their accumulated reserves were distributed to residents as compensation for the legal uncertainty they'd endured. These days, Sarah and I tend our garden in peace, and my shed stores her tools without requiring anyone's architectural approval. The neighborhood is quieter now, more relaxed, with people actually talking to each other instead of reporting each other for covenant violations. Property values have increased because buyers no longer have to worry about arbitrary fines or approval committees. The lake is still beautiful, the common areas are still maintained, but now it's done through voluntary cooperation instead of legal threats. Sarah's health has improved dramatically since the stress ended. She's talking about expanding her garden to include fruit trees. We've learned to read every legal document carefully and never assume that people in authority actually have the authority they claim. Sometimes the smallest inheritance can change everything, but only if you're willing to dig deep enough to find out what you really own. And sometimes the best revenge is simply asserting the rights you had all along.